quite separately, I think, Tommy, turn our minds to the international situation. At the TUC, there was a very strong motion on peace in the Middle East, which called, amongst other things, for immediate withdrawal from Afghanistan and also immediate withdrawal from British forces from Libya, as well as calling for, which was carried, TUC to endorse the call for the recognition of the state of Palestine. Now, at the party executive, at the beginning of the months, I said that maybe we should remember yet again the international standards, double standards of imperialism. When the National Transitional Council in Libya got fast-track UN recognition within 12 days, but in God knows how many years, but Obama is even saying it's not the right time for Palestine to make a bid for UN membership. And if that really doesn't put the sort of the role of imperialism where it belongs. Given the events in Libya just now, and today is National Liberation Day called by the National Transitional Council, I thought I ought to remind you what the party position is on Libya. When in March last year, the UN resolution 1973, which was the one that created the falsely named no-fly zone over Libya, we described that as doing no more than providing cover for external military interventions by imperialist powers. Then in October, or 8 months later, we continued to impose that intervention, and at that time, on our assessment, a minimum of 30,000 people had been killed and much of the country's infrastructure had been destroyed. And you saw the absolute, I mean, somebody said it looked like the Battle of the Somme, the pictures of Sirte in this morning's papers. At the end of September, if you remember, Britain's Minister of State and Trade and Investment visited Libya to seek orders for British companies to rebuild this infrastructure. Much like Iraq, the first people that went in were those who wanted to rebuild the infrastructure, capitalist and transnational companies. This illustrated, in our view, the primary objective of those external powers that had intervened, namely control over Libya's immensely valuable resources. You will also remember that once the fighting, whatever it was, and just after that UN resolution and when NATO started going in, suddenly the funds that had been frozen in the sanction against Libya were suddenly unfrozen to provide arms to the revolutionaries, the rebels, or whatever they were. So there were resources. Libya did have resources, and most importantly, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine in fact president of the International Federation of Journalists, who himself comes from North Africa, reminded us that in that part of the world, Libya had actually the highest standard of living, because whatever else Gaddafi did, and I'm not having any apologies for Gaddafi, he'd redistributed wealth in a way that was somewhat more egalitarian than any of the other oil-rich states. And you will, this is me intervening now, but you will have seen yesterday the horrible photos being taken of Gaddafi's corpse. How could they afford those cameras unless there'd been those phones? They had phones more modern than mine, taking these photographs. Now, there had to be some wealth in that country that had been redistributed for youngsters to have those types of photos, but still. So, throughout, our position throughout as a party has been to support the initiatives of the African Union to broker a peaceful settlement between Gaddafi's government and his opponents. In our estimation, Gaddafi's government was never socialist, although it carried out some progressive social policies. It did use repressive measures against all criticism and opposition, including, of course, banning the Libyan Communist Party. But the United Nations sanction for the intervention sets immensely dangerous precedents for military intervention in sovereign states, in ways that, in our view, are directly contrary to the principles of the UN Charter. And finally, most relevant for today, any government put in place by the NATO coalition, or as an aside, by our assisting the NATO intervention, and not by the Libyan people democratically, can have no legitimacy. I think it's useful as communists to remind ourselves of that, because it's most likely to be the question you're asked in the canteen or at the bus stop, or maybe tomorrow morning. The other thing, of course, tomorrow we'll have the result of the election in Tunis, where in the past week there's been lots of debate about how the parties are going to break down and how many people are going to rally round what's rated with the 25% support that fundamental Islamic grouping has, and lots of people saying we didn't find a revolution just for to have an Islamist government imposed on us. We fought for a non-sectarian, secular society. So, that was the Arab Spring. Let's see what the Arab Autumn brings. I just thought that was I thought it was an important point to make.